Alright, this is an introductory video on the topic of territory and boundaries. So, the crossing of boundaries, either personal, territorial, or moral, is always fraught with meaning. Boundaries serve as important social markers in every human society. Boundaries are always, to some degree, imaginary in the sense that they are always socially constructed. It is human beings who attach meaning to boundaries. We decide which boundaries matter and which boundaries don't. Of course, as you might imagine, and as you're probably aware of, different human societies place emphasis on different sorts of boundaries. Now, boundaries serve all kinds of human purposes, but a chief purpose is moral, to mark out areas where different sorts of behavior is permissible. So to give you some kinds of prosaic examples, what's appropriate at home is not what's appropriate at work or in school or at church. There are different rules of conduct depending on the context in which you're in. And even if you look within the home, what's appropriate in one area of the house may not be appropriate in other areas. And so even within the home, we separate different domains of appropriateness and different contexts where different sorts of human behaviors will or will not be morally appropriate. What separates these contexts, of course, is certain physical boundaries. We can call them walls, but even in the absence of walls, there might be just imaginary lines. Our bodies are another boundary. Interference with that boundary is always fraught with moral consequences. And finally, our individual rights are often conceptualized as a boundary, which can either be respected or infringed upon. Right? So when we think of rights violations, we are thinking very much of a crossing, the crossing in this case of a moral boundary. Even if our physical bodies have not been impinged upon, that does not mean that a boundary crossing has not occurred. For example, in Western societies, we often think of a certain space around our bodies as a kind of bubble, and if people get too close to us, we start getting uncomfortable, perhaps because it starts feeling like a threat, or perhaps because it starts feeling too intimate. But either way, we feel that long before anybody touches us, a person can certainly have crossed a boundary. Note that that boundary of personal space is going to be different depending on the culture that you're in. Now, the modern notion of sovereignty is tightly wound up with notions of territory. A state's sovereignty defines its jurisdiction, and its territory roughly reflects the extent of that jurisdiction. So beyond certain territorial boundaries, a state's authority diminishes or lapses entirely, whereas within it, a state's authority might be fairly strong. Now, some people say that, like all animals, human beings possess a kind of territorial instinct. We're hardwired, in some sense, to defend boundaries. And while that might be true, unlike many animals, human beings do have to decide what to do with their instincts and how to channel them. Humans have to decide which boundaries will best serve their purposes, and sometimes that means going against our instincts or channeling our instincts to defend some boundaries and to place less emphasis on others. Furthermore, human beings also have to decide what kind of boundaries those boundaries will be. How should we think about what it means to have a boundary? So although boundaries look fixed and imposing, or they look fixed and imposing in the short term, in the medium to long term, boundaries and how we think about them can change quite a lot. So we shouldn't think of boundaries as inflexible constraints. How we conceptualize various sorts of spaces, domains, and territories can change over time, and we can think about the boundaries between those spaces and territories differently over time. Now, one important function of boundaries is to separate domains of jurisdiction, and this helps settle the perennial perennial political question, which leads to conflict, of who decides, right? Who gets to decide? Oftentimes, many of our conflicts revolve around this question. So this is true of international borders, but of course also state borders within federal systems, like the United States, and property rights for individuals. the clearer the answer to this question of who decides, the fewer conflicts arise. If we all know that this piece of property, this piece of land is mine and not yours, then we'll have fewer mistakes. It'll also be easier to punish people who encroach upon that land, because we'll be able to, if it's widely known that that piece of land is private or even public property, the person infringing upon it will not be able to claim ignorance or claim an equal right to move about on it. So the international legal system is largely set up to define boundaries and prevent inappropriate crossings. We've talked about this when we talked about the notions of sovereignty. Furthermore, the tremendously destructive nature of modern warfare has motivated a significant amount of conservatism in international law when it comes to boundary crossings. So by that I mean international law frowns upon boundary crossings quite a bit. However, there is still a little bit of a tension at the core of the international state system that threatens this way of looking at boundaries, this really conservative way of looking at boundaries. The United Nations both recognizes the rights of territorial states, but also recognizes the right of peoples, particularly to self-determination. And these two things can come into conflict quite often. Peoples and states are not usually coterminous, even today. Some states are multinational, like Canada or China or Russia and most African states. Some nations simply don't have a recognized state to defend their interests. The Kurds and the Chechens come to mind here. And of course, individuals on their own or with their families emigrate all the time from one place to another, meaning the distribution of peoples and the distribution of territorial units are never quite coterminous. Moreover, we know this even more clearly because nearly every state admits to having extrajudicial zones on its territory, namely foreign embassies. We all know from every single spy movie that's ever been made that if you can reach the boundaries of an embassy, you are literally on foreign soil, and states are very, very reluctant to infringe on that domain of sovereignty, even technically within their borders. Okay, so like I said, the international system definitely frowns on authorized boundary crosses. This should not be news to you. But as states consent to more and more limitations on their national sovereignty through treaties, international law has to start weighing the relative importance of different kinds of unauthorized boundary crossings. Individuals, of course, are threatened by other individuals, but they're also threatened by states. So our personal boundaries are the subject of threats. States, of course, are threatened by other states, but states are also threatened from within by secessionist groups. Groups of citizens or even non-citizens or residents who would like to set up their own state. And this, of course, constitutes a threat to them. And finally, if we look at intermediate groups between the individual and the state, you have families, you have international non-governmental organizations, INGOs, multinational corporations, MNCs, churches, and again, other intermediate civil society groups all claim to have boundaries that require respecting, and within which they will get to make their own decisions. International law has had to accommodate more and more different sorts of actors and the claims of more and more different sorts of actors, which means it's had to redraw the boundaries, but also redraw the significance of the boundaries. Actually, that happens a lot more than the redrawing of the boundaries. Territorial boundaries don't get redrawn very often, but what those boundaries mean in terms of trade or refugees or emigration of other sorts, or religious liberty for that matter, all of those things can in fact change according to international law, even as the boundaries themselves don't appear to change very much. Let me give you an example of this sort of awkward fit between territorial states and peoples and international law. There's a rule of international law that states that states emerging from colonial administration, so states that were formerly under the colonial tutelage of an imperial power, had to accept the boundaries drawn by colonial states. And this rule was perhaps meant to ensure a stable transition and to limit warfare that might seek to change those boundaries, and so to protect the people who lived in these states. I don't think anybody was under the illusion that these boundaries had been drawn particularly well, but the worry was that if African or Asian states were allowed to redraw the boundaries however they wished, that would create a significant amount of tension and conflict and would be to the detriment of everybody living there. But it's really not clear how stabilizing this rule has been. Modern warfare is certainly very destructive, but it's not just interstate warfare we have to worry about. We also have to worry about conflicts within countries, civil wars. And nationalist pressures have made civil wars quite frequent in places where you have multinational and multi-ethnic states. Sub-Saharan Africa, places like the Congo, formerly Zaire, Rwanda, Burundi, the Sudan, all of these, Central African Republic, Niger, all of these places have experienced pretty much ongoing levels of conflict. Angola comes to mind. Pretty much ongoing conflict for basically ever since their independence. So the borders aren't drawn particularly well with respect to peoples, and that creates a certain amount of conflict. And it creates a certain amount of conflict with international law, which seems to recognize both the rights of states and peoples. Moreover, I think it's important to note that economic geography makes some states more viable than others. So states that do not have access to seaports, for example, are under a market disadvantage because they have to, and if they want to export anything, they have to rely on other states. They're dependent on other states that are around them. At the extreme, you have microstates that are completely enveloped by other states. I think Lesotho, Swaziland, and Africa count as examples. Vatican City and San Marino or Monaco are all states that are completely enveloped by one other state. And of course, that creates some problems for those states. So economic geography makes some states more viable than others. Also with respect to natural resources, right? So, access to the sea is one kind of resource you might imagine, but of course, states differ in their ability to feed themselves, in their access to valuable mineral or oil resources, and in their placement with respect to international trade. So some states are quite lucky in the sense that they exist on big trading or shipping routes. Other states are kind of out of the way and so have a harder time getting involved in international trade. Again, all of this means that some states are more viable than others, and this is going to create some kinds of pressure, some kinds of conflict. Many people in the colonial world see this rule, see this conservatism in the international state system as a way of weakening and dividing formerly colonial peoples. Right? It's a way of keeping Western countries, keeping them in power, and sort of dividing and weakening peoples all over the world, because of course most Western countries have borders that are roughly coterminous with national peoples, whereas many parts of the developing world have no such fortunate congruence, and so because of that are often subject to more conflict and more difficulties than those Western states. So in addition to increasing or decreasing the likelihood of destructive armed conflict, I think we can say that the way boundaries are drawn and conceptualized can also help or hinder trade, help or hinder collective self-determination, as we just saw, help or hinder the escape from tyranny, help or hinder access to basic human rights or economic opportunities. So thinking a little bit about how borders and boundaries and territories are drawn up, in part is thinking about the functions that imposing boundaries has, and the consequences that this has for the people living within those territories, of course. Lauren Lemaski, in one of the readings you had to do, I think puts it quite nicely, that in addition to thinking about how to draw the boundaries, where to draw the boundaries, we should also think about what kinds of boundaries we want to draw. So, for instance, he distinguishes between hard boundaries and soft boundaries, right? He talks about hard boundaries as being boundaries that are difficult to cross, right? So at the extreme, you have fences and border guards like the Berlin Wall that make it very, very, very costly and difficult to cross from East Germany into West Germany. Or you have soft boundaries, boundaries that are very easy to cross. In some cases, boundaries you might not even notice. So if you look at national boundaries within the European Union, those countries that are party to the Schengen Agreement, you can move between, say, France and Belgium and Luxembourg and Germany, and you'll never have to show a passport, and you may not even really notice that you've crossed a boundary because the currency will be the same, only the language will change. Soft boundaries also exist between different states within the American Federal Union. So when you're crossing between Tennessee and Kentucky, or Tennessee and Alabama, again, no border checkpoints, no guards, no walls, no fences, no attack dogs. It's not like crossing from West to East Germany, and yet it's also true that the laws to some degree change, that the rules, taxes, and other obligations that you will, rights and obligations that you will have will change somewhat depending on where you happen to be within the United States. So there are hard and soft boundaries, and which kind of boundaries, hard or soft, or how hard or how soft, which kind we adopt will largely depend on our values. What do we care about more? Do we care more about individual self-determination or collective self-determination more? If we care more about collective self-determination more, then we might want to try to keep people out. If we care about individual self-determination more, well, we might want people to have access to at least jurisdictions where people can determine themselves individually, or places where rights are well protected, and we want to make it perhaps harder to get into places where individual rights are not well protected. Another question we might think about is, how do we handle the trade-off between liberty and security? Soft boundaries make it easier for criminals, as well as terrorists, as well as other kinds of nefarious groups to enter a territory and to disrupt the ordinary workings of that territory. On the other hand, hard boundaries very clearly impose limits on our individual liberty, on who we can trade with, on where we can go, and on what terms we can go there, and who we interact with, and so on, where we can travel. So, there's a trade-off there between liberty and security. And finally, we have to ask ourselves whether we're mostly cosmopolitans or mostly nationalists, right? Nationalists, of course, value collective self-determination within a nation, very, very strongly. Cosmopolitans tend to think that people are roughly equal in rights, or at least deserve equal rights, no matter where they are born and no matter where they reside. And so that'll affect our attitudes towards how hard or how soft we want our borders to be. Okay, so that constitutes an introduction to the topic of territory. I think I will have a little bit more to say as we go along. But these issues of hard and soft boundaries and what the purposes for which we delineate different contexts, different domains, different territories, these issues are right at the heart of international relations.